Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is part 2 of the Texan Revolution. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. In part 1 of the Texan Revolution, I explained that the Mexican government had permitted Americans to emigrate to Texas to create a buffer zone between the Comanche and the more settled parts of Mexico in 1823. But events did not go according to plan, and the New Mexican citizens revolted slightly over a decade later. The revolution should not have been a surprise, since there had been several attempts by American adventurers to conquer Texas and separate it from Mexico during the decade before the start of American immigration. Tired of conflict, Santa Anna sent troops under General Martin Cos to restore Mexican control over Texas. Cos had horrible timing, landing his troops in September when the crops had already been harvested and the weather would be comfortable for another 3 months. Worse, Stephen Austin had finally been released from prison, and the ordeal had destroyed any desire to cooperate with the Mexican government. Instead, he preached rebellion and immigration from the southern states to turn Texas into a slave country. Furthermore, news of the massacre of hundreds of civilians after Santa Anna had crushed a revolt in Zacatecas had spread to Texas, causing people to feel that they had no choice but to fight. Learning that Mexican troops planned to seize an old, rusty cannon at Gonzales, over 100 men under John Henry Moore gathered there. An easy victory over Mexican cavalry on October 2nd attracted recruits, and the army swelled to over 300 men in a couple of days. 1 week later, another rebel force seized the lightly defended fort at Goliad. Although taking up arms against government forces would be considered rebellion by most people, the Texans claimed that they were loyal to the 1824 Constitution, even though it outlawed slavery and refused to allow non-Catholics to settle in Mexico. Its main attraction was that it had been revoked by Santa Anna, so the colonists could pretend that they were still loyal citizens of Mexico, part of the growing Federalist movement which was trying to overthrow Santa Anna, even though they were separatists who wanted to break Texas off from Mexico. Clearly, no one took seriously the idea that the colonists were rising up to defend the 1824 Constitution, since they failed to attract recruits from Tejanos or Mexican soldiers who were opposed to Santa Anna's centralist dictatorship, aside from Juan Seguin and roughly 24 Tejanos. Cash poor and land rich, the rebel government used land to attract volunteers. This was an irresistible lure, since almost all of the public land in the United States had already been claimed. The revolt in Texas had perfect timing, because if you were a young American male dreaming of adventure, then the Texas revolt was the only game in town. Most Indian tribes in the South had been pacified, and having seen the need for a professional army during the War of 1812, the Federal Army was becoming, well, a real army that had little respect for the militias. So the large number of Southern militias had no chance to do anything other than march around. The majority of the Texan Army was made up of volunteers from the U.S. who had signed up for 3 months, the minimum time needed to qualify for a land grant. Even the fiercest advocates of independence were surprised by the speed with which the Mexican forces had lost control of Texas. Within the space of a month, every Mexican strongpoint in Texas had fallen, except for the Alamo, a fortified mission at San Antonio de Bexar. The rebel siege of the Alamo began on November 3rd, but the men's motivation faded as the weeks passed and the weather grew colder. Fearing that men would abandon the siege, veteran filibuster Ben Milam made a speech asking, "Who will follow old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" recruiting enough men for a major assault on December 5th. After several days of savage fighting in the streets, the rebels suffered a serious blow when Milam was killed, but they soon learned from captured prisoners that Mexican morale was falling because General Cos had almost 2,000 mouths to feed in the Alamo. Aware that his men were starting to desert, Cos surrendered on December 9th, and he marched the surviving troops back to Mexico 4 days later, leaving the rebels in complete control of Texas. When the arrival of Mexican troops in September 1835 transformed a simmering conflict into open revolt, Stephen Austin had sent out a call for each community to select delegates to a consultation that would debate whether or not to declare independence. Aside from creating a temporary government that included both a governor and a governing council, when the consultation ended on November 13th, it had achieved little other than rejecting independence. This may seem strange since the colonists were actually fighting Mexican troops at the time, but most of the strong supporters of independence were at the Alamo, so the conservative faction was dominant. The consultation also decided that Sam Houston would replace Austin as commander of the army. Houston was at the consultation, not at the front, because he wanted the command, viewing it as a stepping stone to higher office. Once the Alamo had been captured, everyone believed that the Mexicans would not be able to retaliate until April, when the weather would be better, so the senior rebel leaders began arguing over who was in charge, instead of preparing to face Santa Anna. James Grant, one of the greediest land speculators, was able to convince the majority of the men at the Alamo to march on the port of Matamoros, which happened to be where most of his holdings were located. Not only was it hundreds of miles away from the Alamo, it was not even in Texas. Doubtful that the 12,000 residents of Matamoros would be overwhelmed by 200 Anglos hungry for plunder, Sam Houston's opposition is understandable. However, this debate soon became part of a wider battle over who would command the army. Regular army officers like Houston and his second-in-command James Fannin, or popular elected officers like Frank Johnson and Grant. So, how did Santa Anna react to news of the revolt? When General Cost surrendered the Alamo to Texan rebels, it became clear to Santa Anna that the time for negotiation was over. Although his army had 30,000 men on paper, in reality it had a tenth of that. Many of the 6,500 men that Santa Anna led to Texas were conscripts, basically whoever was unfortunate enough to be caught by his press gangs. Santa Anna planned to launch a lightning strike across Texas, but he knew little about the region or its weather, so he was unaware that his lightning strike would have to cross barren land. An experienced general, Santa Anna knew that his army was not ready, but his contacts in Texas had informed him that boatloads of American volunteers were arriving every week. If he waited until the weather improved, he would likely find himself facing a proper army. Santa Anna planned to repeat the victorious suppression of American filibusters in 1813 and use the rebels' defeat as an example of his power, thus deterring other would-be rebels. When the army encountered Cossa's retreating troops on December 26, Santa Anna ignored their parole and ordered them to join the army. If Santa Anna seems to have been overconfident, that's because he was. In fact, he was so confident, his main concern was that the rebels would crumple when the vanguard appeared and another general would have the glory, thus becoming a rival. One theory is that he had become dependent on opium. The Mexican army was only observed on February 23rd when it was 1.5 miles from San Antonio. The rebels immediately fled inside the Alamo, which was merely a strongly built mission, not a fort. Command soon fell to William Travis because Jim Bowie's most recent drunken binge was one too many for his immune system, and he was struck down by an unknown disease, most likely tuberculosis, pneumonia, or typhoid. Actually, the garrison of the Alamo probably could have slipped out during the first few days, since it took the Mexicans several days to dig trenches all around the Alamo. If they could have escaped, then why did they stay? There has been considerable debate about Travis's motives. A simple explanation is that Travis felt the men would be quickly captured and executed, so they were safer within the Alamo. One possible interpretation is that he deliberately put his troops in a dangerous position in the hope that Houston would be forced to rescue him. If so, it proved to be a fatal miscalculation since Houston did not have enough troops. Furthermore, Houston was probably not inclined to take his reports seriously since Travis had little military experience and had spent most of the war burning prairie grass to ensure that the Mexican cavalry had nothing to feed their horses. Although the Texan colonists were shocked when they learned that Santa Anna's army had showed up a couple of months early, the farmers continued to farm and the politicians continued to struggle for office. Where was Houston anyway? Realizing that he was not really in command of the mob of volunteers who viewed him as a tired old man, and that he would have no real authority over the army until after the convention started on March 1st, Houston left Washington on the Brazos in early February to negotiate a treaty with the Cherokee, returning on February 29th, just in time for the convention. Receiving Travis's reports, he told the other delegates that Travis was exaggerating the danger of his position. In fact, the delay in receiving messages from the Alamo meant that the convention was not even aware of the full danger in time to save the garrison. The convention to debate independence officially started on March 1st, including Houston, had experience in Congress, either at the state or the national level. Among the 59 delegates, only 10 had lived in Texas for more than 6 years, while almost a third had only lived in Texas for 6 months. Only 5% of the delegates were Mexican, even though they made up 16% of the population. So it should not come as a surprise that the Declaration of Independence was modeled on the American version. The declaration was adopted by the delegates within the space of an hour, and it became official on March 3rd. This speedy decision-making was largely the result of the intense debate that had taken place between the peace and war hardliners and the moderates during the consultation. Runaway slaves seeking sanctuary with Mexican troops had been a major cause of conflict that had led to the revolution. The delegates were determined to prevent further slave-related problems, so the fiction of life indentures was replaced with a statement that slaves were slaves for life and free blacks could not become citizens. Although recent arrival Davy Crockett had been offered a position as a delegate for San Agustin, he had realized that his chances of becoming governor rested on a record of military service. So he rapidly enlisted and was sent off to the Alamo. It is impossible to overstate Davy Crockett's celebrity. Crockett was the first American to become a folk hero while he was still alive, and he was one of the first to campaign by pointing out that he was a common man fighting against the elite. Growing up in poverty, Crockett had failed to make a living as a farmer before serving in the Creek War of 1813 to 1814. Although he constantly moved to find better land, he hated farming and never succeeded as a farmer. However, he discovered that he was a natural politician, first in the state assembly, then winning a seat in Congress after property restrictions had been removed, enabling all white men to vote. Winning his second race by a significant margin, he attracted national attention. Initially a supporter of President Andrew Jackson, he gradually became disillusioned, and he was the only member from Tennessee to vote against Jackson's Indian Removal Act in 1830. Unwilling to tolerate opposition, the Jackson camp responded with an unpleasant campaign against him, and Crockett lost his seat. However, a play and books about him were hugely successful, so he won his next election. It proved to be a temporary victory since Crockett's opponent in the next congressional race was openly backed by Jackson, and people had realized that he had not actually accomplished anything for his district. It was a close fight, but he lost. Making his farewell speech, Crockett told his constituents that they could go to hell and he was going to Texas. Hoping to start again, he decided to explore his options in Texas, both in land speculation and politics. Santa Anna's declaration that he would not give quarter to the defenders of the Alamo was opposed by many of his officers. However, the experience of watching General Arredondo ruthlessly crush the 1813 filibuster by executing hundreds of Anglo invaders had made a deep impression on him. Santa Anna also ignored the advice of several of his generals to wait a couple of more days for the rest of his artillery. Unfortunately for the Mexican conscripts, their lives mattered less to Santa Anna than his position in the political pecking order. He worried that General Jose Urrea was acquiring too much glory cutting up the rebel forces in the south, and if cannon knocked down the walls, it would deprive him of a glorious and bloody victory. Despite Travis's numerous messages, the only reinforcements who reached the Alamo were 32 hungry men from Gonzales. Actually, his main hope was the garrison at Goliad, commanded by James Fannin, but on March 3rd, he received a message saying that Fannin was not coming. Once Fannin had learned that Urrea had destroyed both Johnson and Grant's forces, he decided to stay at Goliad where it was safe. To be honest, this was probably the right decision, since his men would likely have been sliced up in the open by the professional Mexican cavalry. When the Mexicans attacked at dawn on March 5th, cannon fire tore holes in the initial waves of the Mexican troops, and the carnage would have been greater if the rebels had had the trained artillerymen needed to quickly reload the cannon. Badly disciplined, more Mexican soldiers probably died from friendly fire than from rebels. However, once enough Mexican troops had made it over the wall, muskets with bayonets proved to be more effective than Bowie knives or long rifles without bayonets. Even the Mexican commanders admitted that they had lost control of their army, which should not come as a surprise given the savage bloodlust needed to take a fort. In the end, a dozen non-combatants were saved, including Travis's slave, Joe, Joanna Alsbury, her baby, her sister Gertrudis Navarro, Susanna Dickinson, and several other Mexican women and children. 6 rebels, possibly including Crockett, were captured by General Manuel Fernandez Castellon before soldiers could kill them. When the prisoners were presented to Santa Anna, he was disgusted that one of his generals had contradicted his orders, so he had all 6 men executed on the spot. 182 rebels had been killed at a cost of over 600 Mexican casualties. Santa Anna still had an army of over 5,000 men, but he had not planned on that many casualties. Despite the unexpected number of casualties, Santa Anna was now free to march on the more settled areas of Texas, and I will discuss the consequences next episode. Thanks for listening.